What is going on in the world of Minneapolis and Minnesota and that region right now?
Well, you know, the weird thing, Ben, is it has been oddly calm, which is good. And I think that this community truly needs that because of all of the things that have happened over the last 2 years. Folks are ramping up for the 1-year anniversary of Daunte Wright in order to honor him and celebrate his family. There's quite a few events that are planned for this weekend. But outside of that, we've been following a story. There was a lot of community response to the requests by an Indigenous woman that were denied. An Indigenous woman who is currently incarcerated was seeking medical attention, and her request for medical attention has been denied. And so there was a lot of rallying that was happening around this woman. Her name is Shakoya Brasswood. And unfortunately, I think there's a portion of the population that can only focus on why she's in jail and cannot then in turn humanize her and see why she deserves to have adequate medical attention. She currently has a bullet lodged in her spine, and she needs to have it surgically removed. However, her requests for that surgery to happen have been declined. She actually had it scheduled, but she was detained before the surgery and was asking if she could be released specifically for the surgery, and even those requests were declined. I want you guys to take a listen to this video. Nadia Sharawi, who I work with a lot, actually had the chance to drive. Their family lives like 3 or 4 hours away from us. So she drove to meet with Shakoya's sister. This is an interview with her sister and also a phone call from Shakoya while she's behind bars. Take a listen.
This call is from an inmate at a correctional facility and may be recorded or monitored.
The cop panicked. I think he panicked when he saw my gun and kind of just went off, and he tripped while he was shooting at me. So I'm guessing he would have finished his rounds if he didn't trip.
Shania Bassett, or tribal member. I'm 22 years old. Shakoya is my sister, my little sister, by like 2 years. They went on a high-speed chase, and Shakoya was in the back seat with 2 other of her friends, and they started racing around, but then the cops started like bumping into the back of their car, trying to get them to stop, or like bumping into their bumper to get them to stop, and they just kept ramming into them. The cop lost them for a little bit and then found them again, and then they ended up in Nadawash going around a turn, and that's the cop ended up putting the car into the ditch.
Told us to get out of the car, put our hands on the car, and I had a Glock in my armpit and an extended clip in my other armpit, and it was really big. So he said, "Put your hands on the car," and it was gonna fall out. So I grabbed it out, put the clip in, but he heard that. He turned around, saw he had a gun, and just started shooting me. And then he tripped. The second shot. Fell backward. They shot at me 7 times. I guarantee he would have shot more if he didn't trip.
30 minutes after, the ambulance got there and brought her to the hospital here in Monoman. Then life flighted her to Fargo. I had to call like 2 in the morning, and I couldn't believe it. So I was like, "What?"
I still have this bullet in my back. I don't know when I'm gonna get it out. They don't have a nurse here that's full-time. The nurse that shows up is part-time, and she comes in when she can.
Alright, well, I'll talk to you later. Text me.
Alright.
Love you. Yeah, I'm trying to fundraise for my sister. We need money for a lawyer and her medical bills. I'm trying to raise at least $20,000 for all of this in her situation. I have hope that we'll get, and faith that we'll raise the money for her and that she gets justice.
And so the odd thing too is Shakoya was moved to another jail facility without even her family's understanding, knowing they weren't alerted to this. And so now she's even further away. But, you know, when I shared this story, there was a lot of people in the comment section, you know, arguing whether Shakoya is innocent or not. And, you know, she had court yesterday. She's going through the legal proceedings. She, you know, is hoping to get legal representation to fight whatever charges she has. That is a whole separate issue, right? That's a whole separate conversation. The issue we are trying to point out is that you have a woman who needs a critical surgery, who had it scheduled, and the jail refused to allow her to attend her surgery, which could cost her her life. And when we look at situations like Hardell Sherrill, who died in jail, when you look at Kelsey Rayner, who died in jail, there is a critical issue here. Just because you are charged or convicted, if you're incarcerated, does not mean you're not a human being who does not deserve adequate medical attention. That is the issue here that people need to see. That you have a woman, a 20-year-old woman, who has requested medical attention and her requests have been denied. That's a problem.
That's a serious problem, Georgia, especially for those of us who understand what this carceral state actually is. The only thing inmates have traditionally been provided with on a reasonable basis is health care. Like, it's sad, but some people get better health care in prisons than they do outside of prisons, right? And so for them to refuse this from her, to me, has to be rooted in the fact that this involved a police shooting. This is just my opinion. This is just my take, because I don't know of many other circumstances, unless you're Black. You already listed a couple where they intentionally do these things to Black people. But I'm looking at this situation. I'm like, it's a surgery. And if she dies as a result of not having this surgery, there's even more culpability. So why would they put themselves in this harm's way? And it's because the cruelty is the point. When you have, especially when you have an encounter with the police, the cruelty is the point.
Absolutely. Well, we will continue to follow the story. Ben, there was a huge community response when people learned about Shakoya's story and a demand at that jail for there to be some type of medical attention given to her. So we'll continue to follow it. Yeah. Hopefully she gets the medical attention she deserves. But, you know, when you are arrested, number one, it doesn't mean that you're guilty. That's right. And even if you are guilty, it doesn't mean you're not human.
That's right.
If you're incarcerated, it is the state's responsibility to provide any adequate medical attention you may need while you're incarcerated. That is their responsibility. That is the oath that they take when they say that they're going to protect and serve.
That's right.
And what we see continuously is a pattern that once folks are in that system, they don't care. They turn a blind eye. They intentionally deny people the medical attention that they need. And it's sad. And on top of it, these institutions, these systems, some of them are private, make billions of dollars from taxpayer dollars. And what they're doing with it in this case, they're not allowing this individual to get their surgery. I just one last thing, Georgia, before we go to the next story. You know, the powerful can get away with whatever they can get us to excuse away on their behalf. And when you mentioned this story at the beginning, you were talking about how people in the comment section were like, oh, well, she's in jail. Oh, she did this. And this was why she was there. And that became a justification for her cruel and unusual punishment now that she is in jail. And I just want to remind folks, the more the powerful can get you to say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about that because they did this, they did that. That brings us one step closer to all of our rights being infringed upon. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah. And to double down on that thought, Ben, if there are circumstances that allow you to not see a person's humanity, does that say more about the system or does that say more about you as an individual? And so I think people need to Like, really think about that as they're looking at stories like this and they're so quick to say, oh, well, that person deserved it.
Right.
You know, we're not talking about a serial killer. We're not talking about a person who has caused harm to children. We're talking about a 20-year-old woman. And so when you talk about people who, you know, commit crimes, even the way that they tried to vilify George Floyd, you know, or I mentioned Dante Wright, they try to vilify him, criminalize them, right? Yeah. And so if you have done something that is wrong, we've created a system that we have put our faith in as a society to be the place where people can go and course correct, right?
That's right.
So let people go do their time, but do not strip them of their humanity in the process.
That's it.
And that's the part for me where it's like the criminalization and the dehumanization of individuals who are in trouble or who have made a bad choice. That's the part for me where it gets tough, you know, and it's hard for me to respect people who criminalize, especially people of color. They're quick to do that. They're quick to dehumanize us, and say that, oh, well, you deserve this. And no, it's inhumane. That's
right. It's inhumane. Absolutely, Georgia. I hate to triple down on that, but okay, let me move on, because that what you're talking about right there strikes at the core of so many stories, whether we're talking about Russia's invasion or Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, all the way down to this story. It is a statement of, if we can turn a blind eye to someone else's suffering, what does that say about us? It might say that we work for Fox News. Talk about a segue. Well, according to Fox News, a study shows that Fox viewers, they change their mind after 30 days of detox. After 30 days of watching Fox News and instead watching something like CNN, their opinions about critical issues have changed. I want to read this from CNN. Fox News viewers who were paid to watch CNN for 30 days eventually became more skeptical and less likely to buy into fake news, according to a new study. The study, titled "The Manifold Effects of Partisan Media on Viewers, Beliefs and Attitudes," of 763 participants, when they were randomized 40% into a treatment group to change the slant of their media diet. They offered treatment to participants $15 an hour to watch 7 hours of CNN per week during September of 2020, prioritizing the hours which participants indicated they typically watch Fox News. Here's the good part, the interesting part. Despite regular Fox viewers being largely strong partisans, the study found that the changing of their media diets on their factual beliefs, attitudes, perceptions, and issues of importance and overall political views changed. This is according to the authors of the study. So as soon 30 days after unplugging from Fox News, and in this case, plugging into CNN, their views about critical issues, including COVID-19 and the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine, those issues started to change. Wow. Why am I not surprised? You know, we talk often here on this show, and just even in conversations that we have behind the scenes, about the power of media, the influence of media, how much media is responsible for the conditions of our nation right now. And some people put a lot of stock in that and they agree. And others, you know, they think that we are where we are for other reasons. But media is a central figure of our society. It has played a central role in conditioning the minds of Americans. And Fox News specifically, I've talked a lot about their branding and their positioning, and how at some point, it even seems like the FCC should be able to step in and say, this is false advertisement. That's right. You're not news. This is entertainment. There's been a lot of, clarity behind the scenes with their company that they're entertainment, not news. So why is it not called Fox Entertainment then? We don't have TMZ going around claiming to be news,
because it's entertainment gossip.
That's right.
You know,
That's right.
So why has the checks and balances, which is the FCC in this case, allowed them to position themselves in a way and manipulate a huge portion of the population to believe their rhetoric, to believe their lies, to believe their hatred. And now we're seeing that manifest in January 6th. We're seeing it manifest at school board meetings when you have all these people who are, protesting CRT being implemented in their schools. We're seeing the manifestation of their ideologies and their rhetoric in our real lives.
That's right.
So when will there be an intervention? If you have studies like this that can now prove it, and it's not just a claim by people like me who are accused of being on the left or being a Democrat or all of the things that someone who watches Fox News would say about people like us to try to defend their positioning. Now we have research, we have a study that shows how manipulative Fox News is.
Right. And I want to make a minor correction here. I said include the war in Ukraine. It did not include the war in Ukraine, but what it did include was questions on COVID and Donald Trump. On COVID, and this is again from the reporting, on COVID, viewers who switch were 6 percentage points more likely to believe other countries handle the virus better than the U.S., 5 points more likely to believe that people suffer from what's known as long COVID, and that people simply suffer from long COVID. And then 11 points less likely to say a president should focus on containing violent protests than the pandemic. One last point that changed. These are all their opinions that changed after just 30 days of not being watching Fox News. They found large effect of watching CNN instead of Fox News on participants' factual perceptions of current events, meaning their beliefs of current events and knowledge about the 2020 presidential candidates' positions. The researchers said they discovered changes in attitudes about Donald Trump and Republicans, as well as large effects on their opinions about COVID. So, yes, Georgia, in fact, every person who is watching Fox News is watching an entertainment network that is telling them that they are viewing factual, fair, and balanced information. And as soon as they are unplugged from that machine, they start going back to some sense of normalcy.
Yeah. And think about what that does also to like somebody's political beliefs when you have a whole network that is backing an individual, regardless of whether or not they're qualified or have the country's best interest at mind. But oftentimes, likely they're just spending money with that network, right? And so you start to get into this really scary place where you have, it feels hypnotic. It feels in some ways when you think about what Fox News is doing, it's hypnotizing people. It's pulling people into this fake world and manipulating people, deceiving them. And we've seen folks actually take action based on the belief system and the values that are perpetuated on that network. So if we have fact-based evidence and research that shows what this network is doing and the harm it's causing, what are we going to do about it? What is the FCC going to do about it? At what point is there an intervention? And it brings me back to also like just the basics of integrity and honesty as moral principles that we value in our society. And while maybe it's not illegal to lie on TV, while maybe it doesn't specifically violate a policy of the FCC, if we don't ethically as a society figure out a way to put some roadblocks in place, I mean, even locally, there was 1,300 ethics complaints filed against the mayor in Minneapolis for lying about the Amir Locke case, right? And the mishandling of that. But those ethics complaints were dismissed. And so to me, it's like, even when we have the evidence that there has been wrongdoing, there has been lies, dishonesty, we don't have a system that has the integrity to intervene and course correct. So we're allowing for dishonest leadership to lead our cities, our states, our countries. That's really dangerous. I mean, honesty and you know, being truthful is like the bare minimum requirement for good leadership. And so we've opened ourselves up as a nation by not having checks and balances in place to root out bad actors.
That's right. And not only can we not root out bad actors, Georgia, it seems like the more bad of an actor you are willing to be in this country, the further you can go. Donald Trump, for example, like there's just a list of people who not only fail up, but their integrity is lacking, but that seems to be their pathway to success. So Fox News is certainly one of those. And you're right. Our entire society is really hanging on the precipice, ready to fall over into the abyss because of an entertainment network that has more views than all the other news networks damn near combined. And that's why I think we're in the situation, so many of the situations that we're in.
Good morning. This week in Minneapolis, we're following an anti-Asian hate movement. There have been dozens of people who have stepped forward, not just in honor of the victims who were killed a year ago during the spa shooting, but to really talk about the intersectionality of the movements between those fighting for Black liberation and those just all the way in general fighting against racism. I want you guys to go ahead and take a look at a clip from a march this weekend here in Minneapolis.
And we are called together to stand united against all that is coming against hate. Hate is something we were never meant to hold. It is our kryptonite as humans. And so together we come together, we stand together, we march together, saying that ain't right. When Asians are under attack, what do we do? When Asians are under attack, what do we do?
I was in 9th grade when I first remembered a man commenting on my body and calling me all sorts of objectifying comments. I would routinely see that man on the sidewalk near my house every day. And I remember coming back from school, feeling knots in my stomach, wondering, was he going to be there again? Was he going to approach me? Was something going to happen? And I was lucky that we never got into any sort of physical altercation. But Asian femmes and Asian women and queer folks shouldn't have to be lucky to be safe in their own neighborhoods from harassment and violence. This country has been built on a culture of hate and violence since the start. This violence is historical, long-standing, and ongoing. It's deeply embedded in our policies and our cultural attitudes. Violence against Asian Americans wasn't just in those moments that I had with that man on my block. That same anti-Asian violence was when I heard story after story growing up of immigration raids in the Asian immigrant communities in New York where I grew up at, where people have to wait 20 or more years to reunite with their families because they're not able to get visas. So I want us to think, as we honor the lives of people here today, to also think about the beauty and joy that we have in our community, that we are going to keep fighting and building towards a world where queer folks, Asian femmes, Asian women, Asian elders feel safe, where families get to be together and they're able to thrive together.
What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it?
My curiosity when we published this story, Ben, was the comments. When I went through and I really started looking at the comments and people's responses to this story, I was a bit disheartened. There was actually a lot of people who talked about how there also is anti-Blackness in the Asian community, pointing to specific cases where there was, I think, a 6-year-old boy who was killed by a Black boy killed by an Asian neighbor, pointing to, you know, the officer Tutao who didn't intervene in the murder of George Floyd, pointing to even how some Asian folks can be considered as white passing. And it saddened me because when we approached this story, we were looking at the intersectionality of the movements between the Asian community and those fighting for Black liberation. But the audience's response to it pointed out actually the fractures within those movements. So I
Absolutely.
just usually I have a pretty good gauge of how people are going to respond. But this caught me off guard a little bit.
Yeah. Good morning, Georgia. It's always great to see you. You know, I have to say it didn't catch me off guard because that's literally what I was going to talk about from the same perspective that you're holding, right? It's very true that there is anti-Black hate everywhere on the face of this planet, including our Asian brothers and sisters. No doubt. It is also true that, I mean, honestly, in the Black community, there are more Asian Americans making money off the Black community than the Black community. I mean, it's just the stores that are owned, they're not owned by Black people in the hood, right? And these are the perspectives that you're going to hear in these comment sections. But here's the thing. We have a far greater evil that we are all collectively fighting against, because just as that Asian officer didn't do anything to save George Floyd, there was a Black officer who was there that didn't do anything to save
That's
George
right.
Floyd. There is Black officers who have been a part of this policing system that has cracked down. So I'm not trying to answer one whataboutism with another whataboutism. I just want to say, isn't it sad how easily divided all of the people who have something in common, white supremacy, our fight against white supremacy is in common, but it is so easily to divide us. And I'm sure that's the root of a lot of the comments that you read.
Yeah, absolutely. And that division in many ways prevents us from uniting and having the economical force that is required to tackle white supremacy and capitalism, right?
That's right.
And so I think to be conscious of that and to engage in conversations where, these concerns that people are expressing, it's not that they're invalid or inaccurate, but we have to create spaces where those conversations can develop into solutions and
That's right.
understandings, right?
That's right.
And to also understand the difference in generations. When you look at the case where the 6-year-old Black child was shot by his Asian neighbor, there's also some generational differences. When you look at a firstborn generation into this country, their culture and values are different, and their understanding of race and white supremacy is very different. And so
right.
when you actually do engage in some of these conversations and you start talking to second and third generation, Asian Americans, their lived experiences are very different than their parents or grandparents who came here without any understanding of what white supremacy is or the history behind race and the role that they play and where they fit into it. And so it's very easy for families who are not from America to be indoctrined into this caste system, right? And not even really see their role in it.
No, because it's easy. You know what it is, Georgia? I think every human has a propensity to look for someone they can look down on. And if we as individuals aren't, I don't know, zen or mature enough to realize that we need coalitions to fight this greater evil underneath which all of us toil. And I don't mean to try to sound poetic, but I'm going to be honest with you. If we cannot unify with people of other races, other orientations, other genders, just if we cannot really have a level of coexistence where we can cooperate with people who don't look like us, think like us, talk like us, believe like us, love like us, then we will never beat white supremacy. And I'm sorry, I've got my eyes gunning for white supremacy.
Yeah.
Not the Asian community.
It's something that we share, I think, a common ground we stand on. So I'm with you. And from my understanding, you're tracking a story this morning as well.
Absolutely. And there's so many issues that we do need unification around. One of those issues is absolutely the fact that the climate The IPCC is issuing a dire warning on climate emergencies. The UN's climate body issues its final report for the next decade. The world is on a fast track to climate disaster, according to the UN Secretary General. This clip is a little lengthy, but one of the things that we absolutely have to talk about, Georgia, is in the next 50 years or less, if we are not prepared, all of these conversations are for naught because we're destroying our environment. Let's take a look at it.
The jury has reached the verdict, and it is damning. This report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a litany of broken climate promises.
In his typically blunt language, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was withering towards the world's leaders, calling today's UN report an indictment of their inaction against climate change. The third and final part of the latest IPCC report, written by hundreds of scientists from around the world, finds that greenhouse gas emissions from 2010 to 2019 were at their highest level in human history. At this pace, the planet will blow past the goal of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius in just 8 years. The UN report argues that without substantive, sweeping changes, warming will make life on Earth increasingly dangerous and deadly. While the report cited some increase in positive climate policies, it said much more were needed. This report is principally focused on the concrete actions that nations can take to reduce the emissions that are driving climate change. Those include a rapid turn to cleaner ways of generating electricity and using it as the principal source of power in our buildings and our vehicles. Adapting the infrastructure of our cities, where over half the world's population lives, to make them more efficient. Harnessing the ability of the land, forests, waterways, and how we farm to release less carbon and store more of it.
Human activities got us into this problem, and human agency can actually get us out of it again. It's not all lost. We really have the chance to do something.
So, given those warnings, how likely is it that world leaders will, in fact, do something? Dave Roberts writes the newsletter called Volts.
The tools we need to solve the problem, to mitigate the problem, are growing ever more sophisticated and ever more cheap and ever more plentiful. So the need to do something and our ability to do something are both rising alongside one another. And the biggest single item on the list is clean electrification. And the tools for electrification, which are mainly wind and solar power, batteries, and then electrolysis to create green hydrogen. All four of those technologies are on what are called learning curves, which means every time the global deployment of those technologies doubles, their price drops by a predictable amount. If they just stay on those learning curves that they're on now, they are going to dominate the landscape within.
So, Georgia, listening to that full report from PBS NewsHour, one of the things that troubles me about this report is the fact that we have the capacity to address it right now. And I think this falls along the lines of everything else, all the other absurdities that we see day in and day out. There are problems, there are existential problems. Like, we're dealing with the entirety of this planet, and we have gotten to a fever pitch in this society where, despite the evidence, despite the scientific evidence, the conversation around climate change has been so politicized that we can't even take advantage of good economic opportunities. There's money to be made in green energy, but the oil companies have so much control over this country that we can't even make that cash.
Yeah, it's
and save the environment.
I mean, it's self-sabotage. When you really think about the way in which we are living on this earth, the way in which some companies have structured their wealth, it is 100% self-sabotage. The best thing that came out of the pandemic was there not being traffic, there not being pollution, and the earth being able to breathe for the first time since the inception of vehicles, right? But instead of companies saying, this is actually better for our bottom line if we're not in these buildings. It's better for the earth if we're not requiring our employees to travel and commute to these buildings. Let's just let people continue to work from home. Instead of that being the norm, we've seen corporations rush to try to get their employees back into offices. And in return, I mean, yeah, we are back on a fast track to destroy the one common thing that we all have to share. And so it's frustrating that capitalism has created not just a nation, but really a global economy that prioritizes the bottom line over, everyone's earth. This, Ben, we've talked about this. We've looked at corporations who, instead of fixing equipment that could prevent an oil spill, they decided it would actually be cheaper to get the fine from the oil spill than it would be to fix the equipment. These are decisions that we've seen be made over and over and over again, and it's infuriating.
Yes, it is so infuriating, Georgia, because I hate to say this again, but we're talking about the only planet we have. And we're talking about the wealthiest organizations on the face of the planet having such a stranglehold on the entirety of the planet that we cannot do what is economically best as well as environmentally best, because they don't want to go through the hassle of changing the oil companies. They don't want to go through the hassle of changing their infrastructure, the costs associated with changing their infrastructure, right? Here's the thing. They always tell us everywhere we go, school, businesses, teachers, they always tell us to enjoy delayed gratification, right? Don't take what you could have today so that you can have something better tomorrow. And we're dealing with an entire industry who has the capacity and the technology to make trillions of dollars in the future off of green energy, but they want that profit today. So they're not going to change their oil rigs. They're not going to change to wind power. They're not going to change to solar power. They're not going to do any of that because they want their profits today. Meanwhile, they're telling us to wait for delayed gratification. The gag is, if we wait too long, we won't even have a planet to enjoy.
That's right. Well, and to your point, yeah, we have all these corporations who are doing just that. And then we have political leaders who are doing nothing, who are not, giving executive orders. Think about this. During the pandemic, you had governors who issued executive orders in their states to shut everything down. You had presidential orders that came through to shut everything down. There is a way, to force these corporations to do something different. When you look at the greater good of everyone, if that is compromised, if we are moving in a direction where in 10 years we're going to be in a crisis environmentally, why can't the president issue an executive order for something to change? Why, if they can give tax write-offs for huge developers to come in and build 5,000 apartments in a neighborhood where nobody wants them, if corporations can get those tax write-offs, then why can't corporations also get tax write-offs for expenses associated with changing their infrastructure to make it more environmentally sound? I mean, there are so many different things that can be offered. And not to say that these corporations would even want to do that, right? We're making an assumption there. But once you start issuing executive orders because you're acknowledging the danger that everyone globally is in, that's when you start putting some of these CEOs with their back against the wall and forcing them to do something. Because to your point, Ben, we do only have one planet, but a lot of these CEOs, they have access to all of the planets. We only have access to one.
Yeah, that's right.
But they're investing.
They're trying to get out of here.
They're investing in infrastructure to get up out of here. So they're not as worried about it.
Right. Which is extremely foolish, which lets me know that we're dealing with irrational actors. We're dealing with people who have money and either the intellectual incapacity or just morally flagrantly wrong. I mean, they either don't know, don't care, or both. At the end of the day, though, the people have to care for ourselves, because as Jeff Bezos, and we're going to talk about him in a minute, as Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the rest of the oligarchs fly off into space, they're going to leave us here to burn. I mean, honestly, I have seen, I know you're in the north, but here in the south, like I've seen spring and fall come 3 times this year. Trees start blossoming, and then it gets cold again and they start dying. And then it comes back, blossoming again, and then dying. And I'm like, no, this is not a normal pattern for this part of the South. Like, you go to South Florida, maybe. You go to Georgia, no, right? That's not a standard pattern, but it's going to get worse. The weather events are going to get worse, right? The intensity of the hurricanes, the intensities of the storms. I mean, we had tornadoes, right? Like normally tornadoes are is very much in the South, a Southern thing, but like in January, like that's not normal. And we're going to see these strange events happening because the overall environment is collapsing around us, and it is man-made. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go on this one too long, but I think of any of the things that we cover on a regular basis, the one thing that could put us all out of the game very soon is the climate. And it seems to be the one thing, Georgia, that they're ignoring.
Absolutely. And, I don't think that we talk about environmental issues enough, especially when I examine mainstream media and their role in the environmental crisis. Even, going back a decade ago, you didn't see mainstream media really talk about climate reality or, climate issues at all. And then if they did, it was like, oh, we have to talk about both sides. We have to talk about this as though it exists. And then we also have to hear from people who believe it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And when and to me, people talked about Trump being the thing that set off this misinformation culture, or, this distrust for the media, this culture where you have a group of people who just refuse to believe the truth, right? People who refuse to get vaccinated, people who don't believe in CRT, people who think that President Biden stole the election, like all of these, really far right viewpoints. But you could go back 10 years and just look at conversations around the climate and see that there was already soil for those seeds to be planted. There was already a portion of our population that was really in disbelief about what was happening globally.